Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I am very excited to welcome a dear old friend, Katie Bird, to the podcast today to talk about a great one, The Long Goodbye, directed by Robert Altman and starring Elliot Gould, released 50 years ago in March of 1973. How are we doing, Katie?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Thanks for being here, Katie. We go back to Loyola Marymount University Film School. We really got to know each other when we were in Dusseldorf, Germany, studying abroad. What do you remember from that time?
Uh, there's a lot I remember from that time. A lot of things I probably can't say on a podcast. But we all made documentaries together,
That's right.
which was crazy. We had
Mhm.
really bizarre German film professors.
Especially the editing guy.
Especially the editing guy, which is where we learned Gunsmoke together,
That's right.
which has become a personal passion of mine, the Gunsmoke um, history of the Gunsmoke assignment. So I have a lot of memories around that specifically. Yeah,
We
I'm trying
we
to
I
remember.
remember
I'm
we
trying to
spent
remember
a we
like,
spent a weekend in Paris together. Remember that? It was me,
oh,
you, and
that's
Katie
right.
Bodie, and there were like five or six
I
of
think
us.
Sean
John
was
Batten.
there. Yes,
Yeah, it was a
who's
really cool
also now a film
program.
professor. Yeah.
That's right, he is. And he was on the podcast last year for the Garden of the Finzi Contini. We talked about a foreign film last year, or was it the year before? It was recent. But it was really cool program in that we usually had Fridays off, right? So most weekends we get like a 3-day weekend and we get to travel around, see a lot of countries. And it was a really special time in my life, those 4 months in Dusseldorf, Germany. It was in the fall of 2005.
Yeah, it was a crazy time.
Yeah. And now here we are, Katie. It's been, isn't it crazy? I think it's been almost 20 years since that. It's 2023. Doesn't seem like it's been that long since we studied abroad together, but here we are and talking about a film released 50 years ago, The Long Goodbye. Had you heard of this movie before?
I have heard about this movie before. It's been one that's been recommended to me by a lot of
Mhm.
people. Obviously, a lot of like Philip Marlowe heads. I mean, if you've seen the other Philip Marlowe books that have been translated into movies, but also I love Robert Altman. But I will say it's a film I've like struggled with. Um,
Okay.
actually watching. I think for a long time in graduate school, it was like the film I put on before bed because I knew I would be asleep within 5 minutes. Which I probably shouldn't say as like a film scholar, but that's been my relationship with it. And I think there's a reason why it's a very like soporific film. Like it makes you want to fall asleep.
Well,
Because of its plot,
yeah.
which we can talk about.
Yeah, it has this lovely opening with like him just taking care of his cat. I mean, that's like 10 minutes. So that it is kind of a nice way to just drift off to sleep when you put the beginning on. Him like trying to feed his cat, and the cat's like, nope, not having it. Before we get into our movie today, Katie, since this is your first time on the podcast, I'd love for you to talk about kind of what role has film played in your life, and if you have a couple like all-time favorites to share with us, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so as you said, like we were in film school together in the early 2000s during the kind of film to digital
Right.
transition. I think you and I both had also done digital filmmaking in high school, so I think
Yes.
it's been part of my life since like
Hmm.
way back when I did TV production. When I left film school, I worked really briefly in the industry, just doing some like production jobs,
Okay.
but I ultimately made the poor decision to like move to New York during the 2008 financial crisis. And then I decided to go to graduate school, as I think many people did at that time.
Hmm.
I did a degree in cultural studies and literature. And while I was doing that, I was encouraged to go back into film studies because I
Right.
was at the time I was researching movie theater history, art house movie theater history in Pittsburgh. And then I did my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in film studies with a focus on the history of filmmaking professions, specifically the technical crafts, so cinematographers, editors, etc. So that's what my
Mhm.
research has been. And for the past 3.5 years, I've been an assistant professor at the University of Texas at El Paso, teaching both film production or digital media production and film studies. So
Wow.
that's been my life with film. It's been both a hobby and my employment.
So yeah, you have a great passion for this. Like, do you have a few films that really kind of stoked your love for cinema? Like any that go back to when you were a kid or that you love now?
I think, interestingly enough, I think it was actually our time in Dusseldorf.
Okay.
And I don't remember if you were in the same class because Rick Hadley,
Yes.
who was one of our professors from Loyola Marymount, was there in Germany with us, but he taught like a European film history course when we
Yep.
were there, but
Hmm.
not everyone took it. I don't remember who took it. But he focused a lot on like German cinema, so that became a passion of mine. And I think during that class I know we watched a lot of Fassbinder, but I think we watched The Marriage of Maria Braun,
Yes, I believe
which
so.
has since then been one of my all-time favorite films. I love melodramas. It got me really into like Circean melodramas. So like
Mm,
all that Heaven Allows,
yes.
and then everything that came after that. So like Far From
Written in
Heaven.
the
So
wind. Yeah.
Written in the Wind. Yes, like so anything that is a colorful, lush melodrama with tons of mise en scène, big emotions is what I'm into, and I think that came
Mm.
from being in that class. Yeah.
I
So I
remember
think
we
that's when I started being excited. Not yeah, I mean obviously I was excited about film because we were in film school, but I
yeah.
think there was something there that I was like, oh, film can be art, in a simple way, or it can do something more than just be about narrative or be about what it says it's about. There's all
Right.
these other things going on. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great class. I remember it was only 5 or 6 of us. I think Katie Bodie did it. I can't remember who else was in the class, maybe Batten. But I was remember thinking, like, why isn't everyone doing this? This is fantastic. He was showing us every week. He'd show us a great German film. I think he showed us a couple French films because I remember I wrote a paper on Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. I think he showed us that.
Oh,
And then I also
maybe.
wrote a paper on 1, 2, 3, the Billy Wilder movie.
I always when I think about when I think about Billy Wilder, like I think about Rick Hadley, and then also he taught the Billy Wilder
That's right.
class at because he taught
At
the
LMU.
auteurs class, which also included Billy Wilder. And I remember, I don't know if you were there, we went to the Berlin Film Museum
Yes,
one
yes.
weekend,
Hmm.
and this is one of my favorite memories of Rick Hadley because like the bar under the Berlin Film Museum was called like Billy Wilder's. And
Right.
then we like
Yes.
met him for beers there, and we got like the like Berliner Weiss, like the colored like green and red beers.
Uh-huh.
And he was just so happy to be at like the Billy Wilder bar in Berlin. And I like that's the 1, 2, 3 is like the film I always recommend to people. I'm like, I know there's all the other ones, the apartments. I'm like at Hot, but like Sunset Boulevard. But 1, 2, 3, I'm like this is like how we know he's brilliant. And I just so whenever I think of Billy Wilder, I
Yeah.
think of Rick Hadley.
Yeah, Billy Wilder is one of the great directors, and Sunset Boulevard is my favorite film. That's a film I talk about in this podcast a lot. And Hadley didn't introduce me to that movie, but I think his love for Wilder during that time, it definitely had an effect. And my main memory of Hadley is dancing in Prague, but that's another story.
Oh, that's right. Oh, that was such a good crew of people.
Yeah, no, it was
So
such a great,
formative.
such a great time, and so many terrific films we saw there. The Long Goodbye is a movie that I was like vaguely aware of, I'd say, in high school and college because it's like a detective story, and I'm a big fan of that genre. And I knew the work of Altman pretty well. By college, I'd seen MASH, I'd seen Nashville. So, and I would look up a lot of these directors and look at their filmographies and things. But The Long Goodbye, I'd never seen until yesterday. And I had an interesting reaction to this movie in that I was really with it for a while. And then I thought it dragged for a bit. And then it got better at the end. It was kind of like this for me. So what was kind of your reaction to the movie? Like watching it in full? Like, what's your take on this?
So as I said, like this is always going to be colored for me by my relationship with it to sleep.
Right.
And I I have a friend, Johannes Benotto, who's a video essayist, and he has this great video essay about like what it is to watch a film like and halfway sleep through it. And so a lot of this film, I think I'm like, oh, I've seen all of the film before, but I think I've seen all of it because it has like I started it when I was sleeping, and then I would wake up, and then I would fall back asleep, and then I would wake up. And so I think I remember parts of the plot line, and
Mm-hmm.
then I lost it. So when I watched it again this time, I will say, so I watched it last week, and then I watched it earlier this week, and then I watched it again this morning. Um, just so because I was like, I want to make sure to have my bases covered here.
Right.
I think it is intentionally confusing, and
Mm,
that makes it hard to like pay attention to it because unlike I think other detective works that we are supposed to care about the characters and we're supposed to care about the plot and how the define like figuring out who murdered, like
yeah, the
where is
mystery.
Terry Lennox.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't think it matters at all, and so it discourages you from actually really following it, and then I
Right.
think that is a source of frustration. I mean, I think that that fits with an Altman film, that's not surprising, but I think it like I've only, I think now on my third viewing, have a sense of the plot and have a sense of all the characters. But I think the first time I watched it, I was like, who are these people? Did we meet the other wife? Like, who are these people in the background that seem important, but also are not? I had a really hard time keeping, like, following the money, as it were, and following whose was having an affair with whom, which I think that's intentionally built in to the
Yeah.
narrative structure of the film.
Robert Altman doesn't really care about plot. I knew that going into this. I'm like, okay, he's going to tell a detective story here, but he doesn't really follow a by the numbers plot ever, at least from the ones I've looked at for the podcast so far. Films like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is kind of just a quiet kind of travel log with these characters. And we watched this film last year called Images with Susanna York, which was like a really interesting kind of quiet horror film that is really just about behavior. It doesn't really have a plot. So I knew that going into this. And so it kind of gave me some inherent Vice vibes. I don't know if you saw that film by Paul Thomas Anderson, of just like, it's more about behavior. It's more about just following this guy and, all of his kind of quirks and annoyances and dealing with these people. Because I did get confused at times, and I'm not embarrassed to admit I had to look at Wikipedia a couple times. Like, wait, who is she? And how she's supposed to be in a relationship with him? It is very confusing, and I don't think Robert Altman cares if you can follow the plot to a T or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is, it's interesting. I mean, because he often kind of jumps into different genres and then puts his own spin
Right.
on it. I would love to have seen how this played with audiences in the 70s. I purposely did not research it, but I was thinking
Didn't
of
play well.
I mean, I can see that. I mean, it's, you go in expecting a detective film, and even if you know it's an Altman film, like there's something about a detective film that and a Marlowe film at that, that you want something from it. Like you want to
Mm,
be able to care about those things. And even it took a lot for me knowing Altman is not going to give it to me, but still wanting it. And still,
right.
even in this third viewing, being like, does this matter at all? Like, does this killing matter? Does the money matter? I don't think it matters. And it's interesting compared to some of the other kind of like Philip Marlowe things like The Big Sleep, where some of those questions are much more embedded into the original narrative and also like the adaptations. And in this one, it doesn't. And then so you start to wonder why you're even watching it. Other than as what you said, it's part of the experience of watching it, but you really have to like give up on caring about the detective aspect of it.
Well, I feel like another director would have started the movie with the guy coming to his place and saying, "Hey, I need to get out of the country. I need you to drive me to, what is it, Tijuana?" He
Hmm.
wants to take him to Mexico. But instead, Altman gives us 12 minutes, maybe more, of just him caring for a cat. And like there's a long
Yeah.
scene of him like just kind of sorting through food he happens to have in the kitchen, and he puts it on the plate, and then he watches the cat kind of like circle the plate but not eat it. And so he's like, okay. And then we go to the grocery store, the super, or, the quick mart or whatever. And he has that conversation with that guy, like, do you have this specific kind of cat food? And the guy's like, dude, they're all the same. And this goes on for a while. And then you're just like follow. And it's what, like 3 a.m. Like it's like 3 in the morning.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the curry
It's a
brand cat food
quirky
is,
opening.
it's so quirky. I mean, I will say, you asked me to think about my favorite scenes. I will say those first few scenes, I think are actually some of my favorites
That's
in the
right.
film.
It's great.
Even though they're the films there were the moments I fell asleep to, but like, there's so many great details that establish that, like, that the place and time that we're in, the
Yeah.
kind of character he is. I mean, that we start on that like hooray for Hollywood song that then comes back
That's
at the
right.
end, but that
Yep.
the first image we see is actually just like a wood carving or a painting of the Hollywood sign.
Hmm.
And then we like move over to him. We get this moment that's very 1970s, which is like he pulls out cottage cheese from the fridge, which everyone had in the 1970s, and he mixes it with an egg, which
And salt.
weirdly, and salt. But that's like weirdly one of my breakfast things is like I mix eggs and cottage cheese together and make a
Oh,
little
okay.
omelet. So I was very affectionate towards that moment, and he mixes it together in a pie tin with like a pie serving utensil, and I'm like, why does he even have this? Like, why does he have a pie tin? Why does he have I mean, I got really obsessed with all of these
Mm,
details around it because it seems like that's part of his process is to serve the cat in this way.
yeah.
And he's very tied to getting that cat food because he knows the cat will only eat that cat food. Right? It becomes
But
hugely
then
important to the rest of the plot somehow.
but then like the cat, doesn't the cat go missing for a long chunk of the movie? And he's like, "Where's my cat?" He doesn't know where the cat is. And so it's like, so it's a very intriguing way to open the story because it's like Altman is saying to us, don't it doesn't matter if the plot doesn't make total sense to you. Like this is about just following this guy through his little adventures. And I think the specific details of the movie is what makes it really strong. Like I think the security guard who does impressions of famous actors is hilarious.
Oh, I hate that guy. I found him I found him so insufferable. Um Like I was like, this is the I love Barbara Stanwyck. She is one of my favorite like
Yeah.
classical Hollywood stars, and his Barbara Stanwyck is so terrible.
So
Like it's so cringy. Everything he does is so cringy. And who is it for? Like all I we imagine that everyone who lives in the Malibu whatever that the Malibu colony are people
Mhm.
who are affiliated with Hollywood in some way or the arts community. So you can imagine that all of these people find him really obnoxious, which I think the
Right.
film is pointing at that he's just a joke to them. I mean, he's also the worst security guard of all time. Like, I mean, he's allowed like multiple murderers to come in and out. Um, these like mobsters, this terrible detective, like he's not doing his job at all
Yeah.
throughout the entire movie. I mean, no one is actually, but except for the police, weirdly.
I feel like most directors would bypass a detail like that to a very small character. And Robert Altman just like goes with it for 3 or 4 scenes. And I'm like, that's an interesting choice as well.
Yeah, I think I've heard people talk about what this film is trying to say about Hollywood, and I don't really want to like deep dive into that, but
Mm,
I do think there is a lot of like sprinklings of a conversation around Hollywood that comes up, which is like this guy who's mimicking Hollywood actors. The guard dog, the Robert and Mrs. Wade's guard dog's name is Toto. Um,
right. Hmm.
yes, and obviously that it's the film is bookended by these two Hollywood things, and then he's using this kind of very Hollywood genre and well-known Hollywood film character. You know, I mean, there's something he is trying to say about Hollywood, and you could guess what that is, but it's also kind of I get the impression too that Terry Lennox is a Hollywood actor because they talked
Mm.
about he changed his name from my notes Lenny Potts because he said
Oh, okay.
it wasn't going to play well, but and Terry Lennox looks like a Hollywood actor, and we get a sense that no one actually knows him,
Mm.
and I think that's part of it as well. Is like Terry Lennox. I assumed he was a Hollywood actor, or somehow he's affiliated with Hollywood.
Yeah, and yeah, he definitely has the look of like a charismatic kind of Hollywood star. So Terry
Hmm.
comes to our protagonist's house, Philip Marlowe, and he asks for him to take him to Tijuana in the middle of the night. And then was it the next morning, right when Philip returns, that cops are there like saying, "Hey, Terry's wife is dead." And so you clearly had something to do with it if you didn't do it yourself. And so he goes to prison, and that kind of sets the major elements of the plot in motion. What did you think of kind of the beginnings of the detective story with all of those shenanigans
Yeah.
with the
So I
dead
mean,
wife?
I tried to write this down because I was like, we don't get the credits until like 5 minutes in when Terry
Mm,
Lennox is leaving the Malibu County, and then we're kind of intercutting between Terry Lennox driving to go to Marlowe's house and Marlowe in the grocery store, getting the cat food, and it sets up this other kind of trope that runs through the movie, which is
yeah.
all of these different musical versions of the Goodbye, from like the Muzak version to the jazz version to this like Mexican guitar version, which is wonderful. But then also when Terry Lennox arrives, there's a joke about the cat because the cat has just run off.
Yes.
And then Marlowe he's like, oh yeah, my cat's mad at me too. But he's indicating that he sees the scratches on Terry's face. And Terry has already like covered up his hands with driving gloves to not show his wounds.
Mm-hmm.
They have a conversation about, oh, my wife is mad at me, and also the gambling. So two of the things that will come up in the plot. Marlowe basically ignores it, or he chooses not to engage with it, which I think comes up throughout the rest of the movie, is that Marlowe is just actually not engaging in the facts that are presented to him. So he's actually a pretty terrible detective throughout the rest of this film. We don't actually know that Terry's wife has died until Marlowe is in the holding cell.
Right.
Or not the holding cell, in the interview room or the interrogation room, which is also a really fascinating scene because we view that scene primarily from the other side of the glass. And it's like the glass is all scratched and we're getting this kind of, in a very Altman way, like very muffled sound of him kind of speaking. And the cops, as they're referred to throughout this film, the pigs, are like treating him terribly, and he's making a joke out of it. And there's this kind of banter back and forth, but also the cops aren't wrong. Like, they're like, how do you know this guy? This is when we find out that his wife has been, Terry Lennox's wife, Eileen, has been killed.
Right.
We don't know that, but that like takes, I think we're like 15 minutes into the film before we even know that that's the thing. And they're trying to get information out of him, and they say like, how long have you known him? And he's like, I've known him a long time. And it's implied that they've known each other from way back, which is like before college, so maybe high school, but like, we don't know anything else about them. Like, we don't know about their relationship. It's unclear why Marlowe would drive Terry Lennox to Tijuana. He doesn't seem to ask questions, but he does seem to know that there's something up, but he's not acknowledging it. And he refuses the whole film to acknowledge that his friend his quote unquote friend. And I'm very skeptical that they actually are friends. Yeah, because the first time he goes to the Malibu colony, he's clearly never been there before. And if they're friends, wouldn't he have been there before? Like, it's unclear why he's doing this for Terry Lennox, and it's unclear what their relationship really is. And later on in the film, when he's talking to Robert Wade says, I don't know him, even though Robert Wade clearly does know him.
Right.
But Philip Marlowe says, I know what you mean, as though like, I also don't know Terry Lennox. And I think that will come into play, like, you know, by the end of the movie, is this feeling of like, is this about proving that Terry Lennox is innocent, or is this about his own relationship to Terry Lennox, which he seems more interested in conveying that like they do, like his friend wouldn't set him up.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, this is the thing that I've really struggled with with this movie, is like, what reason does Philip Marlowe have to care about any of these people? What reason do we have that they're actually friends? I just don't. I don't think the film cares, but I also think Philip Marlowe doesn't care, and so we don't care.
Yeah, that was some of my struggle with the movie, because he seems so isolated at the beginning. Doesn't he say at one point, like, oh, I have a private detective business, and they kind of like scoff at that? Like, he's not a very important detective in the area, is the vibe I'm getting from a lot of these other people. But then, and the way Elliot Gould plays this character is like, he's kind of standoffish. He doesn't really care about other people that much, but he does really just jump right into this case, and he's interviewing a lot of people. He's talking to a lot of people. So there is kind of a weird dichotomy there. It's like, he wants to solve this case, and at the end of the film, in that last scene, like, he really cares about what has happened. But for a lot of the movie, Elliot Gould kind of plays it kind of like he's kind of above everything. He's better than everyone else with a cigarette.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the things that's said, because as soon as he's let go out of the prison, they say to him, they're like, we don't need you anymore. We've solved it. Like, he killed his wife. This is what happened. And so actually the film could end. Like, if it's a traditional detective film, the film could end. Actually, like, the only thing Philip Marlowe ultimately solves is that Terry is not dead. But he's refused the whole time to believe what everyone is telling him. And everyone says this throughout the whole thing. Everyone knows Terry Lennox killed his wife. Yeah. Everyone keeps saying that. We all know it. And even the cops, every time they say to him, like when he approaches them on the beach after Robert Wade has committed suicide, they say, like, we already figured it out. We already know, like, he had an alibi. That was a real alibi. He was in treatment. and they make fun of him, right? They call him a gumshoe and a transom like all you do as a private eye is like basically investigate people's divorces or adultery. And this is also a film that is about adultery and
Mm-hmm.
about people cheating on their wives, which is actually what the private eye does in all of these like these hard-boiled detective novels. Is like they're just mainly investigating adultery, which is what ultimately is what he's doing. But he says over a phone call, he's like, "Oh, I don't handle divorce cases," but it's clear that that is what he does. That is how he makes his
Yeah.
money.
What
Um,
so something I found interesting about this film is that it's based on a Raymond Chandler book that was published in 1953. And there were
mm,
attempts in the 50s to turn this into a movie, and it didn't happen until 1973 for the Altman version. So I'm curious, does this movie at all feel like a 50s movie to you, or did they try to update it to the 70s? Like, I got some vibes in it. Like, I could kind of see, like, if that was like a Humphrey Bogart or somebody in an early 50s black and white movie, I did feel like Altman shot a lot of this, making it feel kind of like we're in a 50s movie. Did you feel that at all?
yeah, I've heard some like theses about this, which is like why we um one of my friends, Travis, who's a writer for Bright World Dark Room, he was telling me, he's like, I think he wakes up when we see Philip Marlowe wake
Mm.
up, it's like he's waking up from, this other time period, like from the 40s and the 50s.
Oh,
And
cool.
now he's been transplanted into like 1970s Los Angeles. So still where he's from,
Mm-hmm.
still Hollywood and still a private eye, but now he's completely lost in this world. I think that's a really interesting case to be made. He also drives a really old car, which I
Yes.
think is part of it. And even that Hollywood security guard is referencing people that were
Mm.
in sync, right,
In
with
that
that same
period.
time period.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't do Humphrey Bogart, which I think would have been too on the nose. Like he's not gonna. Altman's not gonna do that. I think the other thing is the thing about the private eye and most of those like Raymond Chandler and other like hard-boiled
Mm-hmm.
novels is they are someone who comes from the police force. So
Mm.
they have a relationship with the police that is not dismissive, that is both a distrustful, but also I use the system to benefit me. He doesn't seem to know how to do that. He's just like, you know, snubbing his nose up at the police. But then one of the guys who picks him up, he calls him a deputy. So I'm like, were they partners at one point? And now this guy's driving him home and saying, let me give you essentially the exposition of what has happened in the past 3 days. So that, and the way that guy talks, that character, I forget what his name is, like Deputy Morgan, it doesn't
Okay.
matter. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
some of these people don't matter because we never see them again.
One scene.
But he talks in this very like, I'm in a Hollywood detective movie from the 1940s, from the 1950s. And
Yeah.
he has a very weird dialect that it clearly is written that way. So those are moments where I feel like it's hinting back at this
Yeah.
previous moment. But also it wants to make it really, and I think there's like all of those films were also interested in the kind of seediness of Los Angeles. They're
Yeah.
all of those films are like great Los Angeles films because we're just moving all across the city. And anyone who's lived in Los Angeles knows it's just like you're constantly aware of like how much driving is taking place. So like how
Yeah.
much time is passing. I'm like, if he's going from Hollywood to Malibu,
Yeah.
and then at one point he's in Burbank, and it's like, and then he's down in Tijuana, and it's like this is a lot of driving.
Mm.
So you're aware of those kinds of things in a way that I think those original films were also very interested in. The seediness of Los Angeles, just like how the institutions of Los Angeles functioned, whether that's like the medical community, the police force, these kind of spiritual communities, which is kind of nodded to by these like women who live across the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
The
I
Rockefellers
thought
and
of
Sullivan.
Humphrey Bogart because of that era we had. What's it called? In a Lonely Place, I want to say the title is, from 1950, which is this great
Mm,
kind of LA detective story. I just watched that a couple years ago for the first time. And then The Big Sleep from 1946. So the guy who wrote the screenplay to 1973's The Long Goodbye, his name is Lee Brackett, and he wrote the script to The Big Sleep in 1946, also based on a Raymond Chandler book.
mm,
So I found that kind of intriguing that nearly 30 years later, the same screenwriter to The Big Sleep, also based on Chandler, is now adapting another book by him, The Long Goodbye, for Altman, but in a different decade and a different time when we're not really getting a lot of film noir and a lot of those kind of detective stories. we would get in the 40s and 50s. So I think that also plays
So
into why some of the movie feels like it's old fashioned in that way, because of the screenplay too.
yeah. So Lee Brackett, I is a woman screenwriter. I only know this because like someone told me about this the other day, which I think is
Really?
also part.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
awesome. Oh man,
yeah,
Lee. I had a family member. Lee is. I've always thought of that name as a male. Lee Brackett was a woman. That's fantastic.
yeah, yeah. Also worked on Rio Bravo, right? So like, but also these films that are like very like about like masculine, very masculine, like you know, like straight men being like this is what it means to be a man, which I think is a lot of this film. You know, when we talk about the themes of the film, like I think a lot of the themes of both The Big Sleep and The Long Goodbye are very much grounded in a lot of these men trying to prove their place in the world. And there's a lot of conversations around like impotence and
Mm.
whether they're doing their jobs. And so I think that to me adds something to it, that like she had kind of perhaps was thinking about these things. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to like speculate too
and,
much, but
and there's such masculine stories. That's so fantastic. And
yeah.
she, yeah, as you said, she also wrote Rio Bravo, and her last credit is The Empire Strikes Back from 1980.
Yes,
What
obviously.
a
Yeah.
career as a screenwriter she had. And then
Yeah.
so yeah, I don't know like how she came aboard The Long Goodbye. I'm assuming maybe Altman, or like obviously they knew about her work on The Big Sleep, um based on the Raymond Chandler book, but uh like it's just a different time, a different era. She couldn't really adapt the book here the way she could have maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I will say I haven't read the book. I thought about reading the book before I came on, and that, but I've been told that it is kind of like it's doing a lot of different things that
Oh,
the
okay.
book isn't doing. And I just
Mhm.
didn't want to color my color my approach to the film with the whatever I thought the book might be.
So I have a quote from Brackett. This is what she said about working on The Long Goodbye. She said, I set the deal with United Artists. They had a commitment for a film with Elliot Gould. Either you take Elliot Gould or you don't make the film. He was not my idea, Philip Marlowe, but there we were. Also, as far as the story was concerned, time had gone by. It was 20 years since the novel was written, and The Private Eye had become a cliche. It had become funny. You had to watch out what you were doing. If you had Humphrey Bogart at the same age that he was when he did The Big Sleep, he wouldn't do it the same way. Also, we were faced with a technical problem of this enormous book, which was the longest one Chandler wrote. It's tremendously involuted and convoluted. If you did it the way he wrote it, you would have a 5-hour film, is what Brackett said about adapting The Long Goodbye.
This film feels like a 5-hour film. It feels very long.
It's an hour and 52 minutes. I mean, I like it. I've watched some films for this podcast, Katie, where it says hour 46, and I'm like, this is almost over, right? And I look and it's like an hour 05, and I'm like, oh my God. I mean, you feel the length in that. There's not like, the movie's not chugging along with plot. Like, you're just kind of watching Philip Marlowe interact with a lot of these characters. There's lots of scenes of dialogue, and I was kind of paying more attention as the movie went on to some of the technical feats of the movie. Notice how the camera is almost always moving. Did you notice that when like they're just like talking, the camera's always just slowly dollying
Uh,
kind of around? Like, what did you think of
yeah.
that? Like, I didn't think that it necessarily had to be always moving like that, because I started to notice it.
No, absolutely. I mean, and it's done in this subtle way that I think see a lot in like contemporary television, where it's just like it's not like these kind of like automated slider moves that are just so minuscule that we can like barely notice them. And I thought the same about this, and but these would not obviously have been like dollies and tracking shots, but they are almost imperceptible. And
Yeah.
you also are like, what's the function of this? I mean, I think sometimes the zoom shots are a little bit more trying to draw our attention to something else, but it
Mhm.
does, you're right. I think it's like the camera seems to constantly be moving. It does make us feel like unsettled
Mhm.
to a certain extent. But I also think there's like something that feels, I don't know if like itchiness is the right word, but
Oh,
you're just
right.
kind of like, you're like, I would like to move on. And I think that's the feeling like when you watch film is like it is hard to just kind of sit I have had to kind of like force myself today. I'm like, I'm just going to sit and watch the film. Not that I wasn't like watching attentively before, but I kept wanting to like walk up and do some things because, but then you realize like you're actually so much information is being given to you, not,
Mm,
and it'll be given to you subtly and quickly just through visuals. So if you're just listening to the film, obviously, or just half watching it, like you're not going to get those things. But I think it does make you feel really unnerved and like, I want to get up and like move. And the film does move across like spaces and locations and time. Like we'll end what it seems to be a really important scene, and then all of a sudden it'll be the next morning. But the
right.
transition to that is like in this subtle way, and they're like, okay, I guess I'm here now, or I guess he's over here now.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's also with some of the camera movement is just this feeling of like he's kind of constantly moving and going other places. So yeah,
Yeah, this
but
is
it
what.
doesn't have that frenetic like handheld thing that
No,
we.
yeah, it's always very pristine, very clean. It's not like the camera's like, yeah, handheld up to his face or anything. But I
No.
did notice that in the second half, mostly. I'm like, wow, this camera just never stops moving. So then I did look it up after the fact. Altman said before they started, he decided that the camera should never stop moving. And so for the most of the film, it's on a dolly. The camera movements would counter the actions of the characters so that the audience would feel like a voyeur. He also said to compensate for the
Mm.
harsh light of Southern California, he gave the film a soft pastel look reminiscent of old postcards from the 1940s. So maybe
Mm.
that's another element of the movie that kind of gives it an old-fashioned feel to it.
Yeah, it does feel very like washed out look to it. Very bright white light, like I mean, I think that's contrasted with like him walking around in the day versus like all of these scenes that are set like in the dark. They do feel really discordant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think of Elliot Gould's performance in this? I guess there was he had a lot of films in like 69, 70, 71. And then there was a little bit of a falling out. Like some studios weren't necessarily hiring him for a little while there. And then Altman really said, I want to do this with Elliot Gould. Like, do you think he was the right choice for this character? What did you think of his performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think like if what you're going for is someone who doesn't actually is not a good detective, doesn't actually care, feels very disconnected. I mean, it does feel like a very LA character.
Mm,
Um, he's making jokes, but everyone also has little names for him, like throughout the whole film. Like the police call him like a smartass or a cutie pie. I mean, but everyone has little names for him. Like no one takes him seriously. Like no one takes him seriously as a detective. He thinks he takes himself seriously, but he ultimately is not like asking good questions. But as a performer, you do have these moments where I was thinking of the scene where he's talking to Robert Wade on the beach, and someone had told me that that scene was like just completely improvised.
mm.
But they're really like cute moments where he just kind of smiles at the camera. And there's times when he's flirting with am I saying like Roger Wade, Robert Wade? I'm sorry, I'm like forgetting the characters' names. The author, like he's flirting with his wife constantly.
Hmm.
And those moments are the moments that I think really like solidify. Like they are making jokes about how cute he is and how attractive he is, but also I think that has to do with his personality of how he's approaching everyone around him, and he's like very friendly and sarcastic, and but also I mean that's why no one takes him seriously, but also he's not actually a threat to anything going on. He's not a threat to any of these people, whether it's like the doctor or um Marty Augustine. Like no one takes him seriously because he just seems like there's always this constant question of
Mm.
like, oh, you're just making jokes. And I think he can play that. Elliot Gould can play that off in a way that it's hard to imagine other people at the same time, any other actors at the same time playing that off in such a like charismatic way. Like he almost
Yeah.
feels like he's winking at the camera a lot of times, and he's in that little outfit, like this outfit that he prizes, right? He's like, this is my best shirt when he goes to the police, and we see him in that
Yes.
outfit the whole movie. He makes People make fun of his tie, like I think Roger Wade calls it his JC Penney tie. And then when he goes to save him from suicide in the ocean, he's like,
Hmm.
take my tie. It's like, oh, it's so embarrassing. Like, he lives in this crappy apartment, but like that's part of the suit is part of his persona. And yet it's like not nice. There's nothing special about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think he was the right choice for this role. You think about kind of the big actors of the time, like a Jack Nicholson or a Paul Newman, Robert Redford. I I mean, Al Pacino was just starting out. Al Pacino, maybe, but there is something to Elliot Gould's height. Like he's very tall and he's very kind of commanding, but there's like a sense of danger to him and also a sense of just kind of like nonchalance, like whatever. Like I'm just gonna just go with the flow, kind of a vibe to him. I thought he was the right choice for this role. Like he's really great. I think he's what makes it as good as the movie is. I think if that role had been casted wrong, I don't think the movie would work very well.
Yeah, he's very awkward. Like but he's awkward in a way that, again, like I don't think he feels threatening at all. Like Marty Augustine
Right.
feels threatening
Mm-hmm.
in a real way. Like the doctor feels threatening. You know, no one's worried about what like the Philip Marlowe character Elliot Gould is doing, and I think that's because he kind of shows up. He's funny, he makes jokes, but no one is actually taking him serious. And it's hard to imagine another actor who would be much more intense in that role or would bring so much more severity to it. Like he's bringing a real sense of playfulness to the role and like just goofing around. And you do get, you know, you do get a sense of like some of it feels improvisational in a way that I don't think you would get with other actors during that time. Or
Yeah.
it would just be like too intense. Like I can't imagine Jack Nicholson in this role.
Yeah, we're a year
Be
away
abrasive.
from Chinatown, right? Chinatown is 74, where he plays a detective, kind of like a hard-boiled, kind of old-fashioned
Mhm.
story. That's a period film, but that's a different kind of character. I don't think Nicholson would have fit in well with the role of Philip Marlowe in this story. That would have felt strange.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, the Philip Marlowe character has always been kind of not a jokester, but he always makes little sarcastic remarks. He's always kind of doing his own thing, but he always feels out of remove. And
Mm,
I think what it feels like out of remove for like a 40s hard-boiled detective looks very different in the 70s. Like
hmm
what does it mean to be at a remove in the 70s in Los Angeles? It means you are unfazed by either like the ladies across the way and their naked bodies all the time, or you're unfazed by like women getting beat up.
mm,
Like he just feels completely unfazed by everything because it's easier just not to care, which is different than the like than being unfazed
hmm
that we get from other earlier Philip Marlowe characters, which we do feel like he actually cares. I mean, I've heard different people say different things about this of like, no, actually, the Elliot Gould character does care. I'm like, I don't get a sense of that at all. Like maybe he cares about his cat, but then we lose that thread pretty quickly. So, though, I really want to make this point because I think the film keeps reminding us about animals. The rest of the
Yes.
film, we have constant like lost dogs, lost pets. Even when he's in prison, there's a guy talking about losing his dog. We see a lot of these stray dogs, both on the streets of Los Angeles and in Mexico. Like there's the guard dog at the Wade's
Yeah.
house. I mean, I think animals are a really crucial part of this, of like reminding us that actually we have lost the thread. Like he has forgotten about his dog, and he's theoretically forgotten about like why he should be investigating this in the first place, which is that like a woman was murdered, and no one
Mm,
seems to actually care that this woman was murdered and that all of these men are like ha- having affairs, whatever, but like basically beating up their wives and beating up their girlfriends, and that seems to be like completely brushed off to the side. So I
mm,
feel like the film is also being like there's things happening, and
yeah.
it keeps reminding us of these threads that just aren't really getting picked up on by Marlowe, in which he should be following them, whether he forgets his cat or he actually forgets the murder,
Yeah, you're
which
right.
should
There are a lot of
close.
touches with animals. Like there's that part where he's driving the car and there's that stray dog just in the middle of the road. And we stay like a long time, like 20 to 30 seconds of him honking at a dog and the dog doesn't move. And then it finally kind of starts to walk this way and he goes around it. And it's like a long shot. And you're like,
Mhm.
okay, so
Mhm.
what is this doing here? Like, why do we need this moment of the movie? And it seems to be kind of reminding us, okay, where's the cat? Like where, like this cat that we started the movie with, that he was caring so deeply for, and now he's just like kind of on to this new adventure. And so many great performances in this movie. I really liked Sterling Hayden as Roger Wade. Like he's from The Godfather. He's like he's one of those actors. He was in everything for decades, and this is kind of like the latter part of his career. I thought he brought a lot of energy and kind of quirkiness to that character. His when he commits suicide by going into the water, that's kind of a shocking moment that I didn't see coming. And Like, what did you make of his character and the performance by Sterling Hayden?
Yeah, it does feel very improvised. So when someone told
Yeah.
me that, I was like, okay, this makes sense. He does like seem drunk in a legitimate way. But also, that just has like he has so many great lines. Like one of my favorite lines is like, "We're gonna have an old fashioned man to man drinking party," and then he has that comment of like, "People nowadays
Yeah.
want cocktails," and then with a twist of lemon in it. Like, I mean, those all of those lines are so fascinating, and yet there's a performance he has with his wife, and I think this is one of the few moments that like we leave Marlowe
Mm,
goes out to the beach,
right.
and
Hmm.
we're with the Wades, and we're looking at them through the glass, and then sometimes and eventually we'll actually go in closer to this really intense conversation that they're having, which is, I mean, it's a long scene. It's like 5 minutes of just them talking about their marriage, and there's this suggestion of you're like why he sends Marlowe out to the beach is like, why is he here? Is he here to check up on me, or is he here to hit on you?
Yeah.
And do you want him to stay because you have an attraction to him, which she has
Hmm.
already kind of admitted that she does. So he's saying like, is this going to be the next man you're cheating on me with? Like that's said in the subtext, because we eventually know that like she's been having an affair with Terry Lennox, he's been having an affair with Terry Lennox's wife, right? So there's this thing that's happening, but also they then get into a really intense conversation of that is about his impotence, like not just about his
Right.
drinking, but like his inability to like have sex with her anymore.
Hmm.
And he lists all of these other times they've had sex, and with these like very specific like words that are very sexual.
Yeah.
And then we kind of move into this like intense performance from both of them that gets very charged, and then it eventually turns in, we know from an earlier scene that he has hit her before.
Hmm.
She has a huge bruise on her face, but like we also he like at one point he just like screams at her, like, which is like his profanity, like balls.
Hmm.
And it feels like it reminded me a lot of the Coke bottle scene with Marty Augustine earlier in the film, where that comes out of nowhere and it's cut together so abruptly and so abrasively that it's like, I love this woman, but look what I will do to her. And we get that from the Wades as well. It's like, I love this woman, but I don't mind. I have no qualms about being violent to her.
Mm. Yeah.
And I think that's such a crucial scene. We spend so long on it. The Marlowe character doesn't hear any of this, but we hear it.
Hmm.
Like we hear that there's this intense tension between these two people that is tied to sex and is tied to adultery. And then the next scene, Marlowe goes to the town in Mexico. I forget the name of it.
Mm.
To go find out whether Terry Lennox is indeed dead. And one of the things we cut to are these stray dogs, and then we linger on two dogs that are like a dog that's humping another dog.
Right.
And so
Like
again, it's like
zooms in.
it's constantly reminding us of like impotence and
Yeah.
adultery and sex,
Hmm.
which is underneath the surface of the kind of entire film.
Which I also found
But I think
interesting. Oh yeah, go ahead.
oh no, yeah, that was
Oh,
it.
no, I was just gonna say it's interesting that we never get a sense of Philip Marlowe's kind of sexual history, his interest in women. Like we have a lot of scenes of these like half naked women across the way who are kind of like usually like kind of paying attention to him. He like goes over there, but the movie never really deals with his romance history, like him wanting to bed any women in this movie. This is not Shaft, right? Like we've talked about Shaft on this podcast, where he's like a detective and he's solving a crime and then he's bedding three women along the way. And that's not the case here. When it comes to that, it is really more with the Roger Wade character. That's such a great scene, and I found that scene really striking because it is like the one moment in the movie where we go away from Philip Marlowe. I always find that interesting in a film when we have like a point of view character, and he's kind of our eyes to the story, and then we move away from him just for one scene to spend time with two other characters. I did find it interesting that Robert Altman framed some of the shots where we can see through like the reflection, we can see Philip Marlowe walking along the beach while Roger Wade and his wife are talking inside. I thought that was a really great choice because it is kind of abrupt and kind of surprising to go away from Marlowe for a scene.
Yeah, so right, there's the beach party, which it's unclear why they're having a party. I mean, their friends have just gotten murdered. He's really depressed. he's an alcoholic, so why are they having a party? And then he passes out, and then he's like, well, yeah, make me a bologna sandwich. And, Mrs. Roger Wade says, okay. And then, but she makes him an elaborate, like seemingly like 5-course meal, like
Hmm.
something that's very complicated. She's offering him after dinner drinks. And then and only then, once he's had this big meal and clearly been flirting with this man's wife, then he accuses her of something. And as he's accusing her is when Roger Wade, like as we zoom in, like we see Roger Wade move out to the beach to
Mm.
go kill himself. And then we cut away and we see that the Marlowe character is still kind of interrogating her, but then she notices, right, that her husband is
Yeah.
like going out to sea. So yeah, we get an impression that he's interested in her, but also can't resolve, like, it's not, like, why would he wait that long to interrogate her about this whole situation? I mean, he got a free meal out of it. It's a very weird, and then he's clearly drunk by the time the police show up. Um,
Yeah.
and then he's harassing her and he's harassing people on the beach. And then he's harassing the police, and they're like, yeah, we already solved this murder. So again, back off. I mean, there's a way in which like he's just avoiding everything.
Hmm. I
He's
really
avoiding the truth of all of these situations.
I really like that shot of Sterling Hayden walking off into the darkness. Like that was done really well. Like you don't see him at first, and then the camera slowly zooms in, and then you see him just like a little bit like illuminated under the moon. Like it's a beautiful shot, and them just like running after him. And isn't he like handing her all his stuff? Like I'm gonna go after him, and he jumps in the water, but to no avail. Like he's gone. Like it's a haunting scene. It's really well done.
Yeah, it's it's scary. It's also, I mean, I think the film has kind of telegraphed it a little bit because we've had shots previously when we're at the Wade's house where we'll do this zoom into the ocean. And even the moment when they're sitting out there having their aquavit, um, we we do
Mhm.
spend some time like going out into the ocean and zooming into the ocean, but also there's a brief moment where Roger Way says, "Have you ever thought about suicide?"
Mm.
And then
Hmm.
and then the Marlowe character just quickly skims over it and then asks him another question. And it's fascinating because it's like, yeah, here's this guy who clearly needs help. And he even makes a joke about it to the wife when he drops him off. He's like, oh, if he needs help, like, I'm not the person to help him. Like, he needs actual help. And people do keep saying this, like, this guy actually needs help. But no one seems to be that invested in
Yeah.
actually getting this guy help, either for his alcoholism, but also for the fact that this guy is like clearly suicidal, maybe because he knows who killed the other wife. But everyone's kind of ignoring that. So I do
Hmm.
think the film has like kind of touched that this is going to happen, and the sound of the waves is so oppressive kind of throughout the whole film
Right.
that then when we get it at the end after this kind of suicide scene, it feels that much more so.
Hmm.
Um,
So, what did you think overall of Robert Altman's direction of this movie? Have you seen a lot of his work? What's your take on Altman in general? Like, what do you think he did well or not well in this movie?
um, yeah, I mean, it feels like an Altman film to me, and I think there's like moments that are very like I said, like the muffled sound, the kind of out of remove, but also picking up. There's something really fun about Altman films, and like these kind of tertiary characters are
Mm.
as interesting, if and sometimes more interesting than the people that we're actually following. So
Right.
I love the moment in the grocery store where he walks in and then he has the conversation with the late night store clerk about
Yeah.
the curry brown cat food. But then we see that store clerk in like the next scene at the police station or the two scenes later. Um, and he's like, "Hey man," like, and we get this like kind of weird background detail of like, "Oh, I'm in the police station because the police harassed my girlfriend at a protest and then I beat them up." And
Mm.
it's like such this like rich detail that tells us something about the moment. We do
Mm.
get a lot of tension between kind of the black police officers in the station and the kind of white detectives, which is interesting. They're kind of commenting on each other. So that's an interesting
Mm.
moment, and it's adding this like depth to the film. And I think, there's other characters, even that awful security guard who I don't like, he's there to serve some purpose, to either tell us he's not doing his job and he's more interested in Hollywood. But we have a lot of these characters throughout the whole film, and those remind me of Altman films. It's just that there's so many people going on. There's so much going on that it's easy to be distracted by it, but there's also something that's part of the world of the film. I mean, I think the women that live across from him are such
Yeah.
a part of the world of that film that everyone is like gawking at them and treating them as objects. And, but they also have this like, oh yeah, they're making do because like they're dipping candles. It's like really setting the stage of like we're in the 70s now.
Hmm.
And I, really minor characters are important, like Joanne, Marty Augustine's, which we haven't talked that much about Marty Augustine, and I think
Yes.
we should. Um, Joanne is such a fascinating character because, again, it's that sense of like violence towards women like pervades every aspect of the film, and I do think that's something that
Mm.
Altman is interested in, like in McCabe and Mrs. Miller.
Hmm.
Um, he is interested in like where do women place in these worlds, and even if they're at the periphery, they are at the center in the sense that they are, either things that are getting used. I mean, and I, Roger Wade's wife is clearly scheming something, but someone like Joanne, who's this site of the most violent thing that happens in the film, of the Coke bottle being smashed into her face, and then we
Right.
see her like this like blood gushing out of
Blood
her, and then we see
everywhere.
her
Yeah.
disconfigured face, and her having to say, "No, it's fine. Yes, and she says back to Marty Augustine, she's like, "You called it haunting," and it's like it is haunting to look at this woman's face. And even Marlowe makes a joke as he like leaves the Augustine office. He doesn't even acknowledge this woman, who it's like because he was messing around and not answering questions, like they use this woman to intimidate him,
Hmm.
and there's no sense that he has any culpability for the fact that like this woman has like been treated very poorly at to get information out of him, and
Hmm.
he just kind of walks away from her. And I think that's fascinating. So I think that's a very Altman touch to me. Like there's the technical things which are always very much what he does, but I think there's also the way that he's thinking about all of these characters and the space, that the landscape or the time he's portraying. Like he's very aware of like how do I, even though it's like filmed in the 70s, but it's also making a point that we're in the 70s. I think it's very aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah, Altman's such an extraordinary director. There's such a texture to his movies that I love, and he does really lift up women. I mean, even in a story like The Long Goodbye, which is a very masculine story mostly, like he really does pay attention to the female characters. And of course, later in the decade, we get so many rich female characters in Nashville and Three Women. I think Shelley Duvall's performance in Three Women is like right, just incredible. And so, yeah, that's something I've really admired about his career too, the way he uh, cares just as much about the female roles in his movies as he does the male roles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, here's the biggest question of all, Katie. What did you think of Arnold Schwarzenegger's performance?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like someone told me to look for it, and then I was like, okay, because I don't know that I would have noticed it other because he's only in that one scene, right, where where Marty Augustine makes all of his like
take their
like
shirts off.
Makes them take their shirts off, right, which is a funny moment, and then Arnold Schwarzenegger, like he's just there.
Yeah. He doesn't say a line.
Yeah,
He doesn't say one word.
No.
He's got a
Yeah, it's
mustache.
great. Yeah, it's awful. It's
This
awful.
is a decade. This is more than a decade before the Terminator, and it's a little bit less than a decade before Conan the Barbarian, and that's like that kind of sets his career on fire. There in the 70s, he's in pieces of films and TV shows here and there. Probably his biggest role in a movie is Stay Hungry from 76 with Sally Field and Jeff Bridges. And then he has a documentary called Pumping Iron that comes out in 77. And that's, I feel like, the movie that really brings him a lot of international attention. But it's so interesting when you see a major movie star at the very beginning of their career, just in a bit role in one scene, not one word of dialogue. You get to see Arnold Schwarzenegger towards the end of this film. And it just, I don't know about you, just like completely removed me from the movie. Like it was hard to just like keep watching it as the way I was able to before, because he's such a big star. I'm like, okay, here we go. But that happens in some of these older movies. It was fun to see him.
Yeah, I think someone had already like told me it was there, so then I was like, okay.
I did not know he was in the movie, so I was like, what? Totally.
Yeah, I mean, all of those. I mean, the Marty Augustine character, I think, is one of the best parts of the film because he's just so psychotic and doesn't care, but he's so committed to. I mean, I think that's another tie-in to, right, the like detective novels, like the the underworld crime scene, and that, and Marty Augustine has like some of the best lines in the film as well, like him and Roger, right? Because at one point he says like, what we have here is a problem of communication. He makes this great line about, he's like, no, you don't see the point. Like, you don't see the point of all of this, to Philip Marlowe. He's like, the point is the money. The money
Hmm.
is what matters. And I'll do anything to get my money, right? And he doesn't waver from that. Like, he's a
Hmm.
very clear character. But we also get a sense of like, he talks about how his money provides him certain things, but he's talking about his values that are also weirdly messed up. And then surrounding Marty Augustine is like this crew of his like cronies who, Marlowe makes a joke like, oh, you got an Irish guy, you're a Jewish guy, you got, this guy, you got an Italian guy, but they're all jokes, right? They're actually not doing their jobs either. But they're all very loyal to him.
Hmm.
And we understand that he is like one of the people in the film that has a great deal of power.
Right.
Everything does revolve around Marty Augustine.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Another great character in the movie. I mean, I think what makes the movie as good as it is just all of these specific characters kind of surrounding Philip Marlowe. It's not just his story. Like, we're getting a lot of sometimes just little pieces of other character stories throughout the movie. I found that really engaging. What did you make of the ending? We with Terry and him going to actually, like, it's like the one thing he does, Philip Marlowe does in the whole movie, where he really just like takes control of the situation and he says, "This ends now." Like, what did you think of the ending of The Lost Goodbye? I mean, The Long Goodbye.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's something about The Long Goodbye that's really tapping into the idea of like the lost weekend, right? Because everyone is drinking so heavily
Oh,
throughout this
such
whole
a good
thing.
movie. Another Wilder
Yeah.
title.
Yes. um yeah, but I think it's a thing I've been trying to reconcile with the film, which is, what is Philip Marlowe's relationship to Terry? Why does he care? Because again, what he cares about is not resolving this woman who's been murdered. No one seems to care about that. Like, but there does seem to be something about like, how do they know each other? How are they friends? And is what he's ultimately feeling like he knew from the get-go? Like, he knew from the time that Terry showed up at his house. And then once the police told him Terry killed his wife, he keeps saying, I know him. I've known him a
Hmm.
long time. He wouldn't do that. And what he's trying to honor there is almost like his own perception of this person who he actually doesn't seem that close to. And as I said earlier, like, he said, I don't know this person. So is he murdering him because he feels like he's been wronged by
Mm.
his so-called quote unquote friend, whether that's Terry or Lenny Potts, like his previous name? And so to me, the confrontation at the end is less about anyone else who's been harmed, right? Like, and
Right.
there's been multiple people who died since the beginning of this film.
Yes.
Um, and there's an anger towards Terry, which is like,
Hmm.
I perceived you as a friend. We don't know what that relationship is. So ultimately it's, you made me you made me look bad or something, but also I ignored, I took care of you, or I vouched for you and you screwed me over. Like, you set me up.
Hmm.
And that's ultimately what it is like this story of male friendship that we actually have as an audience. Like, we have no stake in this friendship. We don't understand why it exists. Like, we don't understand. And so, but it's like getting mad at another man for
Mm.
doing something. And I think that's what it's about. And so it's like, it doesn't feel shocking. And it does feel like, it's like, well, yes, he actually did something. So if we want to go back to, not to like keep adding Freudian analysis to this, but like the question of impotence, like, can Marlowe do anything? It's the
Hmm.
only thing he, as you pointed out, like, it's the only thing he does all movie. And it also feels like it's not for anyone else. It's not for a greater good. It's not for his sense of professionalism as a detective. It's for himself. Like, it's for himself of like, you made me look bad, or
Yeah.
I defended you for what, or something. But that's ultimately not about justice in any way, because he doesn't care about this guy's wife. He doesn't
Hmm.
care that like Roger Wade has died. He just cares that like he lost his cat. And but does he care at the end? We don't know. Or he cares that he was made to look like a fool in
Mm.
front of the police and in front of all of these people. And he is a fool.
And
So that's his
doesn't
only way
does
of dealing
yeah,
with it.
doesn't Terry call him a joke too right before he shoots him? Like, doesn't he say like, "You're a
Yes.
loser" or something, like right into his face?
Exactly.
And
Which
everyone thinks that he's dead, right? Like, Terry is presumed
mhm.
dead. So there's no reason in that moment for Philip Marlowe not to just blow him away. Okay. Done with you.
Yeah.
So it's a
Yeah,
fitting moment
Terry's
at the end.
clearly paid off like the Mexican officials to, you know, keep him hidden or a
Yeah.
secret. Yeah, but also it's like, you can't imagine, well, what would happen next, right? There's not a sense of, well, now we're gonna go watch him solve another crime or another like adultery
Yeah.
case. Like,
Yeah, I don't think
yeah.
that wouldn't have felt right if this had been the first of 5 Philip Marlowe movies with Elliot Gould, like a Dirty Harry kind of a thing. Like, I don't know. I don't think I kind of like that there was just the one. If there had been like a
Mhm.
5 years later sequel directed by somebody else with Elliot Gould returning, like, I don't know if that would have been the right choice. I like that this is just a standalone, a one-time movie. Him walking off at the end, was he whistling like just off in the distance as the credits start rolling? It has a
Yeah,
sense of
with the
finality to it, to the end.
yeah, and again with the like bookending it with the hooray for Hollywood. It's so cynical. It's such a cynical beginning and such a cynical ending.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as I think as an audience member, you're like, I don't know that I care about any of these people, or I feel a sense of resolution. And I think that's, I mean, that's also a very Altman thing of just like, okay, I got dropped into this. I feel really dark at the end of this. But also that it didn't matter in some ways. Like none of this mattered.
Yeah, Altman was lucky, right, that he got to make so many great films in the 70s and especially the early 70s when box office wasn't at the top of everyone's minds. Like, this is before Jaws and Star Wars, and directors could just like tell their stories, and he could make cynical movies. He could do what he wanted to do, hop into different genres, and the movies, I mean, I think they wanted the movies to at least break even, right? Like, they wanted to make a profit, but I think like especially in his early career, he got to really experiment with a lot of different genres, lots of different things. And but that's not to say, as you know, audiences did not really care for this movie when it came out. So I have a little bit here. So it was previewed at the Tarrytown Conference Center in New York. The film was not well received by the audience. Altman attended a Q&A session afterward where the mood was vaguely hostile from the audience, reportedly leaving the director depressed when he left. The Long Goodbye was also not well received by critics during its limited release in LA, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Miami. The New York opening was canceled at the last minute after several advanced screenings had already been held for the press. So the movie was not doing well with audiences or critics when this came out in March of 73. I found a quote from Time magazine, Jay Cox. He wrote, Altman's lazy, haphazard putdown is without affection or understanding, a nose thumb not only at the idea of Philip Marlowe, but at the genre that his tough guy, soft heart character epitomized. It is a curious spectacle to see Altman mocking a level of achievement to which, at his best, he could only aspire. So a lot of the critics really were hating on this film, which is kind of surprising to me. I think there's a lot to like in this, and it's like it doesn't seem like the kind of movie that highfalutin film critics in 73 would be thumbing their nose at, but a lot of them didn't like it.
I don't know. I mean, I said this to a friend the other day. I was like, people, if you tell people they're going to see a Philip Marlowe detective film, that's what they
Right.
want. And people,
Mm-hmm.
there's such a strong association with that character, but also Bogart and Bogart's
Mm-hmm.
version of Marlowe,
Yeah.
that is very Hollywood, and that's what people love. And so I think it's interesting that it's done in this way, but I can see this coming out in the 70s and people being like, you know, what
Yeah.
is
What is
this?
this?
What am I supposed to do with this? And I understand the hostility because I'm like, you watch something, even as a film scholar, I'm like, this is a detective film. I'm supposed to, this is going to matter. I think in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, these women across the way are going to somehow come into play in the plot. Like
Right.
they're going to
Mm-hmm.
somehow have seen something or know something. And then you realize they're not coming into the plot. The cat is in the background, but that's not going to be part of the plot. Like all of these things that you think are going to come back into play don't. And I
Yeah.
think that makes you feel angry when you
Mm-hmm.
first watch it because you're like, oh, it didn't actually matter that
Yeah.
I tracked any of this. It didn't actually matter who died or what, and I think that anger towards this is what I expect out of a genre film is real. And I think McCabe and Mrs. Miller gets a little bit of this too of like, oh, I
Yeah.
expected a Western and then I got this. But also I think
Mm-hmm.
Elliot Gould is so different than Bogart. And he's so fascinating, but I can also see like if people were expecting something, and I think there is something about this that is a very Los Angeles film and
Mm-hmm.
also a film that is making fun of Hollywood. And people love those detective movies, and I I do as well, but and they're cynical about Hollywood, but this is cynical about Hollywood in a way that I think is very um discomforting. I mean,
Right.
it's because it's not just pointing at something. It's really just like I think the phrase in that review, mocking it. Like it does feel like it's mocking the detective novel, and it does feel like it's mocking Hollywood. And it doesn't seem like it's, I think on the surface, I think it is actually tender to some of these things, but I think on the
Mhm.
surface it doesn't seem like it cares at all about the audience, or it doesn't care at all about the detective genre, or doesn't care at all about the Philip Marlowe character. But I don't think you wouldn't make a movie if you wouldn't make this movie if you didn't actually care about those things.
Right.
I just
Mhm.
think it comes off to people perhaps in that moment of like, what is this? And
Yeah.
perhaps only with distance, only with like a lot of time. I mean, I know this recently showed in Los Angeles. I didn't go see it. I wish I had. At the New Beverly,
Oh, cool.
for its 50th anniversary.
Oh,
And
okay.
I think that was on 35. And I would have loved to kind of be there in that moment to kind of see it. But I also am curious how it would play. The New Beverly audience is weird because I think everything now is like everything's turned into irony, so like nothing
Yeah.
is taken seriously. So I can imagine like the Coke bottle scene of like I'm not gonna I don't know how people would react, but I can imagine like people laughing. I
Laughing at
mean,
that
at that
time. Yeah.
moment, and it's I don't know. So I am really curious like how that played. I'm sure people will comment like how that played in an audience today,
Mm.
um, versus obviously it played very differently
Yeah. Now, some critics
back in
did
the
like
70s.
it. Roger Ebert gave it 3 stars out of 4, and then later in his career, he added it to his great movies collection. So I think for some critics, maybe as time went on, they started to really have a fondness for the film. But at the time in '73, Pauline Kael, the great Pauline Kael, gave it a rave review in the New Yorker. She called the film a high flying rap on Chandler and the movies. She hailed Gould's performance as his best yet and praised Altman for achieving a self mocking fairy tale poetry.
Ooh,
So she really loved it. Like she was
yeah,
one of the critics at the time who saw that there was a lot of greatness in the film, but most
yeah.
critics didn't.
I love the fairy tale line.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that house, I'm now like obsessed with that house. I've looked up, or that
Oh,
apartment
on the beach.
complex, because it's no, his apartment
Oh,
in
his
Hollywood.
apartment.
Yeah,
I'm sure that's
with
out
the
there
private
somewhere, right?
elevator.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess it was on market a couple years ago, like in 2014, that like you could rent
And
the
they
apartment, and I
and
was like,
you could be in the kitchen where he was trying to serve his cat some food.
yeah, maybe. I mean, it has that great view of
Yeah.
like the whole city. It's just, I mean, LA detective m movies and TV shows are so great because I mean, so much of it is about just like moving around the city, looking at the city,
Hmm.
seeing what's happening around the city. And I think I'm like, I want to make a little pilgrimage to go like view the apartment
That would be
because
awesome. I love that.
it's so iconic. Like every time you go back to the apartment, you're like, ah, this weird apartment that would only exist in LA, where
Yeah.
people are just hanging out outside and it has this strange elevator and weird characters hanging about.
So, despite Pauline Kael's endorsement, The Long Goodbye was relatively unpopular. It earned poorly in the United States. The two kind of prizes it got, I guess you would say, were the New York Times listed it in their 10 best films of the year at the end of the year. And then the only prize it got was Vilmos Zsigmond was awarded the National Society of Film Critics Prize for Best Cinematography. That's the only award it got for the whole year was a cinematography prize from the National Society of Film Critics. I mean, like the cinematography of the movie. It's very striking. It's great. I don't know if I would give it best cinematography of the year, but that's a fine award, I guess. And that's kind of it. Usually, at this point in the conversation, we talk about what were what was an Oscar nomination it received. What was this or what was that? This is I would say of '73. This is probably one of the most well regarded titles of the year that did not go on to get really any awards attention, which I find interesting.
Hmm.
Right?
I mean, maybe that's because of how it treated Hollywood. I mean, like
Yes, maybe.
obviously, yeah, I mean, Hollywood doesn't like it when you're not generous to Hollywood, right? Or you
Yeah.
don't, when you're making fun of it, like, and I think there's enough
Mm,
people that would have been in the Academy and in all of these honorary organizations at the time that were still very much tied and affiliated with those earlier films. I mean, I don't know,
Yeah.
I'm throwing that out there, but
I mean,
yeah, it's cynical.
Altman did very well at the Oscars with MASH. That came out in 1970. That did very well, got lots of nominations. I believe it got Altman a Best Director nomination. And then his next two films don't do as well. McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which a lot of people think of as just a masterpiece now, only got one Oscar nomination for Julie Christie for Best Actress. She lost to Jane Fonda for Klute. And then his last movie, Images, got a lone original score nomination. That was it. So yeah, they're not like, the Academy is not really high on Altman right now. It's going to take till Nashville. Nashville does very well. That's kind of his next like breakthrough hit when it comes to award season. But yeah, Long Goodbye, they were like, okay, try again. We'll see you next year. I mean, Altman was very prolific, right? I mean, it was like one a year for a long while. I don't know if there's a year in the 70s where he doesn't have a movie. Like, he was just on it, man. He'd be on the set of one movie, planning the next, right? And so that's why we get a lot of his work throughout the 70s. So as we wrap up our conversation here, Katie, like, do you have any kind of final thoughts on The Long Goodbye? Like, overall, like, would you recommend people check it out? Like, what were your kind of final thoughts on the movie?
I think it's, as someone who's now watched it 3 times in the past week, like, I think it has grown on me. And there's like moments of it that are just so pleasurable because they're so weird.
Yeah.
And I'm now obsessed with like all of the songs. I started in this last version, just like writing down every time there was like a new Long Goodbye song. And I think my favorite version is the one where he goes into that little like his local bar near his house where they sell sandwiches, and there's a guy like playing piano. That's one of my favorite versions. And then when he goes to the party, the beach party, they're doing like some like hippie version of the song. Like, but like there's probably at least 20 different versions of the song in the film. And now I want to like, I'm sure there's a playlist already on like one of the song services that have all the versions. But like that's a little detail that I'm really obsessed with of this film. But I think there's so many little pleasurable things that now I can see the people who love it, who keep going back and back to it, because that is in some way, I don't want to like compare it to Citizen Kane, but like for me, when I watch Citizen Kane, I love it for like these dumb little details in the film. And that's why I think I would keep going back to this film, is just because of all of these like small little things, like his little cat door with the cardboard cat door that's like written in Spanish. But there's so much of that in the film that is just really enjoyable. That once you get past like, this is not a detective film, this is not a film that I have to care about these people, you can just enjoy, as you already said, like you can enjoy the experience of whatever world this is.
Yeah. No, I really liked the film. I feel like my expectations were maybe set a little too high because I'd heard great things about this movie. Like, I'd read Roger Ebert's Great Movies essay about it in the last 10 years. And I remember thinking, ooh, we get to talk about The Long Goodbye coming up here in early 2023 because it came out in March of 73. And it was a little bit of a letdown for me. I was kind of drifting in the middle hour. You know, I had this problem with Inherent Vice as well, the film by Paul Thomas Anderson. This when it's really just kind of about behavior at times, yet at the same time you're supposed to be following this very kind of tricky plot as well. So you're kind of getting confused, but then so that's kind of taking away your enjoyment of some of these kind of quirkier scenes. But yeah, I would say I really liked it. And of the 10 or 12 films I've looked at so far for 73 that I have not seen before, like, this is definitely one that's going to stick in my mind the most going forward. Like, there's a lot going on here that I'm going to be thinking about in the months to come, and especially that Elliot Gould performance. I was really struck by what he did in this. I think he's great. I've seen him in a lot of stuff. This is probably his strongest performance I've seen of his in a movie. Like, he's terrific, and he's the reason to see it, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned Inherent Vice, because you asked me like what I would pair this film with.
Is that what you picked?
Yeah, easily. Like, this is such, I mean, I hadn't, when I've seen Inherent Vice, I probably like watch it once a year.
Okay.
I love it. Like, I love Inherent Vice so much. It's such a vibe. It's such a 1970s Southern California movie. Again, all of these quirky characters. You don't know, you lose the thread of that plot as quickly as you lose the thread of this plot. You're just like, does this matter? Do I care? There's a weird medical like establishment, right? There's the police that are clearly corrupt. I mean, there's no way that Paul Thomas Anderson is not like constantly thinking about The Long Goodbye
Yeah.
and making Inherent Vice. They're very like even the character, right? You know, I know that's also based off of a book, but even the way that like Joaquin Phoenix plays that character, it does have a kind of similar vibe to the way that Elliot Gould plays the Marlowe character, and they are very both heavily connected, but also they don't seem to care. I just think they're such a great pairing. I was constantly thinking of Inherent Vice when I watched this.
Yeah, that's a great pairing. That's the first film that came to mind. I really didn't like this movie, Katie, when I saw it when it came out in 2014. Should I give it a second shot? Because I really struggled with Inherent Vice, and I love Paul Thomas Anderson. That movie did not work for me.
Yeah, I think Inherent Vice also, I recently rewatched it, I think in December of 2022. And I always remember Inherent Vice of like having this energy and pulse to it. And then I forget, like, it's long. And it like there's times I'm like, when is this movie gonna end? And for something that I've watched a lot, I always actually forget that it's actually quite slow, and you lose a sense of like why it matters and who these people are. And I think if you didn't like that in this movie, I can see why you wouldn't like it in Inherent Vice. And both of them are just kind of like what you're watching them for is like being in that. I like Paul Thomas Anderson films that take place in Los Angeles. Like I love a film that's about Southern California. I think that film really captures that. Like you really just get a sense of it. And the same way that you can imagine those women in The Long Goodbye who are across the way, you could move them into a Paul Thomas Anderson film today. Easily, right? I just think he's interested in the same type of characters. I don't know. I love Inherent Vice. It has a great soundtrack. The scene in like where they're like running in the rain is one of my favorite scenes in like all of film history. So again, it has that thing of like the movie as a whole is disjointed and uneven. And like when I left the theater after I saw it, I was like, I'm like, this is going to be one of my favorite films because of just of how it made me feel and how funny and weird and like open it was. I mean, I will say, I think Inherent Vice is much more sentimental than The Long Goodbye is like not sentimental about anything, but Inherent Vice is sentimental about those characters and is sentimental about their connections. And there is a sense of care or deep connection between. And I think another pairing that I hadn't considered is right. I'm forgetting the names of the characters in Inherent Vice, but the Joaquin Phoenix character and the Josh Brolin character, they have a final like meet up at the end, right? Which is very much like The Long Goodbye of like we're gonna finally encounter each other and you know the kind of sabotage that we've done to each other. So that's another way that they're connected. Yeah,
I like that. Yeah, that's the one that makes most sense. I went with another detective story that I love, and that's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo from 2011 by David Fincher. Rooney Mara, amazing performance, got an Oscar nomination, and Daniel Craig. Did you see that adaptation by David Fincher? Like that movie I thought was just spectacular, and it came out really late in the season, and it didn't do very well at the box office, didn't do quite as well at the Oscars as they thought it would. But that's one of my favorite detective stories in the last 15 years. So I thought I would throw that one in there too. It's very different tonally, obviously, but also made by a master filmmaker at the top of his craft. I do think it's more than just a detective story. There's a lot going on under the surface. Terrific kind of specific supporting characters in that too. One played by Christopher Plummer. That was really memorable. And yeah, that's a good one as well. Any excuse to watch that again. That is just like a pristinely made detective story.
Yeah, but Fincher cares more about detective stories. I mean, ultimately, I'm like, I don't know. In the same way, like Paul Thomas Anderson jumps in and out of genres, and I don't know that Paul Thomas Anderson cares about detective stories in the way that I don't know that Altman cares about detective stories, but like Fincher does, right? I mean, he's made a number of detective films that are very interested in the
Zodiac.
procedural genre. And like Mindhunter and but he cares about the procedural as a way to move through a plot and a narrative, and that with a procedural you can be very precise. And then right, because is Seven him as well, or is that
he did Seven? Yep, that's
Seven.
Also
okay, yeah, which is also a procedural.
Yeah, he's good at that.
He's really good at that. But
Even
you know,
Gone Girl has some of the procedural aspects of a mystery.
yes,
Yeah,
yeah. So I mean, I,
can't go wrong
yeah,
with him.
I mean, I love a detective thing, no matter how it goes.
Yeah,
um, yeah, clearly. But so I'm open to these like weirdo interpretations, and then I'm also very happy with like how can we get the most procedural and technical and really just lean into that, which is what I think Fincher
yeah,
does so well.
yeah, absolutely. All right, that takes us to our final segment, Beyond the Flick. I thought we'd talk a little bit about Elliot Gould. So what else have you seen with Gould? Like, what else do you like him in?
So I'll maybe focus on one,
Okay.
which was recommended to me. It's a great holiday film, a great Christmas film. It's called The Silent Partner from 1978.
Ooh, I don't know that
Um,
one. Let me write it down. What's that about?
it's amazing. So I'm probably going to give a terrible plot synopsis of this, but Elliot Gould plays a bank teller he's in Canada, which also has its own wonderful aspect of it. He plays a bank teller in Canada. He gets a he's I don't remember. He gets some sort of note that there's going to be a robbery, like a Santa character in the mall is going to rob this bank. Um, and so as part of this scheme, he takes a cut of the money for himself as the bank teller,
Hmm.
and kind of hides it away. But the guy who's orchestrating the bank robbery knows that the Elliot Gould character has played this part in it, and he's trying to get his money back. But the Elliot Gould character is just like so different than he is in this film. He's really obsessed with his fish, another like animal connection.
Hmm.
Uh, and there's just these wonderful film. I think is it Christopher Plummer? Yes, Christopher Plummer
Oh, okay.
plays the one
Speaking
he's
of.
going up against. Yeah, so Elliot Gould is the titular silent partner in this bank robbery. There's a really great like murder scene or death scene that involves the fish tanks, and it just feels like very. I think it's set in Toronto. I mean, it's a great talking about films that are like about place. Like I think it's a great like Canadian. I don't know that it's directed by a Canadian, but like it feels very like we're in the north and it's cold and this is what people are doing. But it's a great holiday film. Like if you want to watch like a dark holiday film that's like exciting and you need something that's like not the traditional thing, it's wonderful. It's so fun. It's such a
That's
fun
cool.
film.
I have read
Um,
so many Christmas movie books and like movies you should watch around the holidays. I've never heard of that movie. I wonder
it
why
doesn't
that's
all
not
take
in.
place around the
Oh,
holidays,
okay.
but it the first set piece is in the holiday.
Oh, okay. Nice. The
Yeah,
Silent
yeah.
Partner. How did you
The
hear of
silent
that film?
partner.
Someone recommended it to you?
Um, yeah, my one of my friends who is also like the biggest fan of The Long Goodbye
Oh, okay.
recommended this to me. So it's someone who's an Elliot Gould stan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so looking him up on IMDb, there's so many projects he's been in throughout the decades that I've seen. Obviously, I grew up with him on Friends. He was Ross and Monica's dad on Friends. And then when it comes to films, like of the last 30 years, it's a lot of small roles. He's really great in a small part in American History X with Edward Norton. That's a great film. I worked with the casting director, Valerie McCaffrey, of that movie back in 2008, 2009. And I remember I sat down and watched that film, and I was like struck by Elliot Gould's performance. He has a really great supporting role in that. He was really great in Ray Donovan on Showtime. He's in the movie Contagion, Ruby Sparks, Kicking and Screaming. And the one film we talked about last year that he's in, would have been the year before, was Little Murders, this really kind of interesting black comedy directed by Alan Arkin, the actor Alan Arkin. But so my top three favorite Elliot Gould movies would be, I think I'd throw in number three Ocean's 11, like a later stage film. Like he's really great in Ocean's 11 from '01 with George Clooney, directed by Steven Soderbergh. My number two pick would be his one and only Oscar nomination. It's kind of crazy to think he's been acting in films since the 60s, and his one Oscar nomination came in 1970 for Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. Have you seen that film with Natalie Wood? It's a great kind of romance drama, kind of a story of two adult couples who like they're kind of losing some of their passion, and so they decide to like swap partners. Is kind of the story of that movie, and it's very funny and very witty, and it's like a late 60s movie that I think Natalie Wood is a big reason why that movie is so successful. She's a very charismatic actress, and Elliot Gould. He's not in the movie as much as she is, but he's very funny in a supporting role in that, and that's his one and only Oscar nomination. I think if I had to pick my favorite Elliot Gould movie, it would be MASH by Robert Altman. That's a film I saw for the first time in high school. Kind of like ahead of its time movie, in that you have characters just talking over each other, cameras often roaming, lots of funny situations. Of course, the movie that inspired the hit TV show with Alan Alda. Sally Kellerman is hilarious in the movie MASH. She got an Oscar nomination, and Donald Sutherland's in the movie. It was like the film that really put Robert Altman on the map. I think if you're going to look at like only 3 or 4 Altman movies in his whole career, I think you have to look at MASH. And it's one of Elliot Gould's best movie performances. I think he is great in that film, and it's worth another look if you haven't seen it in a while, or if you've never seen it before. MASH from 1970. So that takes us to the end here, Katie. Thanks so much for being on Film at 50 for the very first time. It was such a treat to have you on today. So much terrific insight into this movie, The Long Goodbye. I thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for being here. This was so much fun. As we wrap up here, Katie, is there anything you'd like to promote or tell our listeners where they can find you online? Now would be the time.
Oh, um, I don't really have anything. Sorry. Yeah, I don't have. Well, okay. I guess I'll say something. So, I guess if you wanted to find me online, the main kind of work I'm doing now is like video essays, which I know Brian is doing as well. And you can find me on Vimeo, vimeo.com/ I think it's Katie Bird.
Oh, cool.
But that's the kind of main kind of source of creative and intellectual production that I'm doing, is like video essays. And they're both kind of personal, but also historical, and they focus a lot on film production.
Oh, cool. We will check that out. So thanks for being here, Katie. Thanks to all of you for listening. You can find us online at filmat50.com. We're on Twitter and Instagram. Check out my YouTube channel, Brian Rowe Video, for all things Oscars. And until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.